We're live.
All right, this is the Senate Education Committee on the afternoon Wednesday, February 11th. We're taking a little time to hear from people from here for the day, Disability Advocacy Day. And so we'll start off by introducing ourselves.
Dave Weeks, representing Rutland County.
Seth Baumgartz from the Bennington Senate District.
Terry Williams, also representing Rutland County.
Steve Hepperman, Madison County Districts.
Thank
So,
you
yeah,
so much.
Floor is yours.
Thank you. For the record, my name is Cammie Naylor. I am going to read from some of the testimony that I submitted, and there are a couple places where I will provide some additional information and illustrations. My name is Cammie Naylor. I'm a staff attorney in the disability at Vermont Legal Aid. Vermont Legal Aid is the oldest and largest provider of statewide free legal services for civil legal services in Vermont. At Vermont Legal Aid, I work in the Disability Law Project. We represent individuals with disabilities whose civil legal needs are related to their disability. The majority of my work over the last 8 years in my time in the DLP involves representing students with disabilities and education-related matters. Thank you for the opportunity to address your committee as part of Disability Advocacy Day today. The theme of Disability Advocacy Day today is right to disability into every bill. And as your committee is considering educational transformation in Vermont, I think that is particularly timely. The Disability Law Project is a sub-grantee of Disability Rights Vermont. Through our relationship with Disability Rights Vermont, we advocate for children with disabilities and educational matters. Our efforts on behalf of children with disabilities involve both direct representation and systemic advocacy. For example, I am a member of the State Special Education Advisory Panel. Requests for representation in educational matters represent over half of the requests for assistance the Disability Law Project receives. In the last 2 years, due to changes in our staffing and increased case needs, we, the Disability Law Project, has played a less active role in the legislative process than previously, and I deeply appreciate the opportunity to be here to speak with you today. It is our perspective that the importance of addressing systemic challenges in the delivery of education and special education cannot be overstated in this moment. At the federal level, we are witnessing the systemic dismantling of long-held systems responsible for enforcing the rights of students with disabilities and supporting the rights of students with disabilities by providing guidance and technical assistance to states and school districts. At the state level, there is a forceful call to transform our education systems and structures to address ever-increasing costs. Last year, through Act 73 of 2025, your committee and the entire legislative body commissioned a legislative report on the current state of special education delivery. This report identified a variety of specific concerns and pressures impacting special education service delivery in our state. As your committee considers the ongoing educational transformation, we ask that you hold an understanding that from our perspective, addressing pressures on special education systems in Vermont requires holding schools accountable to see special education students with disabilities as students first. Not SPED students, students. In recent years, we've observed significant discussion and concerns over the rising costs of special education costs and extraordinary costs in special education. We do not have data available. However, we encourage you to consider the cost of special education and extraordinary costs, not in isolation, not as an independent factor, but in comparison to the overall educational spending trends to better understand how these costs are increasing relative to general education expenses. We believe that considering special education costs in a vacuum contributes to a red herring that children with disabilities are driving the educational cost problems in our state. While aspects of special education are inseparable and distinct from general education, the rights of students with disabilities are inseparable. Special education must be considered as part of a whole, not an entity of education unto itself. We laud the work of the Agency of Education has done to elevate their special education team within the agency. This was an important step towards ensuring that our schools are supported to take meaningful steps to dismantle the general education special education divide. There is a tremendous amount of incredibly complex work on your plate. As you continue to undertake and lead educational transformation in Vermont, we echo the concerns raised by the Act 170 Task Force and in the initial report of the Commission on the Future of Public Education in Vermont. That is, transforming educational systems in Vermont is a complex problem to solve. We understand the pressure to put forth a redistricting map. In fact, I'm looking at it right here. I know the House has done so. But we also understand that the educational funding formula has not been modeled completely, meaning that your committee does not know the impact implementation of the foundation funding formula will have on the funding for educational systems that are already overwhelmed. We do not know if the maintenance of effort and maintenance of state support standards required at the federal level to continue to receive federal support for IDEA will be met. If these metrics are not met, we risk federal IDEA funds, which have never been fully funded at the federal level. We urge you to work with JFO to model the foundation funding formula and understand how, even on a statewide level, the cost of special education will be impacted. So it's hard to model the foundation funding formulas and their associated weights on a district by district or town by town level, because some of those numbers will be too small. You won't be able to get that. But if you model at a statewide level, you'll be able to compare the overall cost of intended, what that formula will do with what's being currently spent. And it's incredibly important in the special education context, because if the state does not spend enough money on special education, we will lose federal funding, further impacting our ability to fund and maintain the systems. And our direct advocacy work reflects many of the findings of the special education delivery report. I want to acknowledge and hold tension for the fact that I hear the worst of the worst stories. I hear the stories from people who are out there with it. That said, we believe that our experiences and our direct advocacy work reflect the systemic challenges. In short, schools, supervisory unions, and school districts lack the capacity, and our students with disabilities pay the costs. In our work, this looks like inadequate staff to provide services. You may recall, and I use it as an important example. To my knowledge, no service letters have not gone out this year, but that doesn't mean that no services aren't happening. So last year, there were 3 Vermont school districts that didn't have enough staff to provide all of the IEP supports, and those districts sent out no service letters to families. And the problem is that, acknowledging that it's an impossible bind, those students were entitled to those services. And a no service letter doesn't meet the free and appropriate public education requirement. Service decisions are being driven by available resources, not individual analysis. So oftentimes I have cases that come through where families have had an evaluation and their child is being recommended for a related service of occupational therapy. They're being recommended to have some direct occupational therapy support. And oftentimes, despite a recommendation for direct services, those services are provided as consultative services. And so the direct services, the child and the provider, and the consultative services being the provider is learning from the team about the struggles and making recommendations. And that's a really important distinction. In our state, we have an over-reliance on paraeducators to support our more complex learners. This often results in denial of FAPE and failure to provide services in the least restrictive environment. And in some cases, it creates extremely complex problems for future educators and IEP teams to solve. I think the best example I can offer you of this is, and this is not just one student, I've seen it happen repeatedly with students, kiddos with certain complex learning profiles who have behavior supports written into their IEP in elementary school. And they still struggle with their behavior, but they're receiving support from the para. And paras do incredible work, but they are also the least trained person in the building. And so we have the least trained person in the building working with our most complex child. And there's the behavior plan, and the para is responsible for implementing the behavior plan, but they're often not given the support that they need to know exactly how to do that. So what we see is the para knows their job is to help support the student to be safe and be able to remain in class. And often the consequence is that instead of supporting the student in learning new behaviors, that para engages in co-regulation. That is that through the relationship, they help support the student to be able to feel safe and be in class, which is an incredibly helpful thing for that student. What it doesn't do is teach the student how to tolerate that environment. So then when that kiddo makes a transition to middle school, which is a more demand-driven environment, where there are greater expectations on students, they often have kind of these catastrophic failures where they can't tolerate their academic work. They become very unsafe with their bodies, often harming themselves and others. And the problem foundationally was that they didn't get the supports that they needed when they were younger to learn how to tolerate that environment. And that is because of our over-reliance on para-educators and the fact that because they're trying to help and they're doing everything they can to help support that student stay in the classroom, there's not a great analysis of, oh, wait, we're not teaching the behaviors this child needs to learn, those foundational learning skills. We still see a lot of soft exclusion of students with disabilities and violation of their due process rights. What this looks like is Tommy's having trouble at school today. He's had some unsafe behavior. He's really having a hard day. We know he's kind of like at his threshold. And so we call mom and we say, hey, mom, Tommy's having a really hard time today. No, this is what's been going on. And that is not, I don't believe, there's nothing about that circumstance that is willful by the school, but that leads to educational exclusion. And it leads to a situation where Tommy now is not accessing all of his afternoon supports. He's falling further behind, which makes the learning environment more intolerable for him. And then we have parents who are like, well, you called me to pick him up. And schools are like, no, I didn't. We called you to tell you he was having a hard time. And then we have these kind of impossible conversations of school and family and it's a he said, she said. But ultimately that student was not in class and they were not receiving their services. And then we have an inadequate continuum of least restrictive environments, leading to an over-reliance on alternative placements with significant wait lists. And having a significant wait list resulted in students with disabilities receiving interim, inadequate services, lacking access to FAPE in the least restrictive environment. We do not believe that lifting the moratorium on the approval of independent schools eligible to receive public funds will solve this problem. We recognize that may help. However, as disability advocates, we're extremely concerned about the limited oversight of independent schools and the privatization of services for our most vulnerable learners.
You're talking about therapeutic schools.
We do believe greater use of boards of cooperative educational services described in Act 68 of 2004, contained beginning at 16 VSA section 601, like the recently approved Southeast Regional BOCES, must be supported and play a primary role in addressing the inadequacies of the educational continuum. So, I think fundamentally, when we're looking at a map, we echo and support the calls to the legislature to support, the words just tumbled out of my brain, voluntary mergers and voluntary cooperatives. Statewide and legislatively led efforts to contain educational costs and transform educational systems in the last decade have been met with resistance and poor implementation. In fact, the census-based funding formula approach to special education developed in 2018 has yet to be fully implemented. So we have an educational funding system that is not fully implemented, and we're in a moment where we're continuing funding differently and asking district offices to make that adjustment. We understand the urgency behind needing to address educational quality and cost in Vermont. We ask your committee to consider that rushed solutions to incredibly complex problems often result in failure, resistance, and poor implementation, and compromised systems. Vermont's children are our future. We must understand all implications changing the educational governance, delivery, and funding will have on the systems and move forward with caution and purpose. Our children deserve systemic transformation that supports their success. On February 28th, I attended a virtual listening session with OSERS, the U.S. Department of Education Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services. As I listened to callers imploring the federal government to continue to fund, support, and enforce special education and rehabilitative services, I heard many adults share their experiences and life successes resulting from receiving the services they needed as children. The repeated message was, these systems are valuable because of their return on investment. This was both an effective and troubling message to hear. At Vermont Legal Aid, we believe all children have value and deserve quality education, regardless of their future contribution. In a moment where so many rights are threatened, I leave you with this. The right to public education is integral to Vermont's constitutional form of government. It guarantees of political and civil rights. Further, the right to education is fundamental for the success of Vermont's children in a rapidly changing society and global marketplace, as well as for the state's own economic and social prosperity. To keep Vermont's democracy competitive and thriving, Vermont students must be afforded substantially equal access to quality basic education. However, one of the strengths of Vermont's education system lies in its rich diversity and the ability for each local school district to adapt its educational programs to the local needs and desires. Therefore, it is the policy of the state that all Vermont children will be afforded educational opportunities that are substantially equal, although educational programs may vary district to district. I'm reading from 16 VSA Section 1. We thank your committee for your work and investment in all of Vermont's children, especially Vermont's children with disabilities. I'm happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Yes.
You bring up a lot of great points, but our issue, I don't want to say but there, is affordability. And that's what we're running into. The services that are needed and required is affordability. Can we as a state continue to afford it? And what are the best routes? Like you were saying, doing sharing and that I think is going to help. But that's what we're up against. When we have people come in and say, it's like, he knows.
Yeah, you do know this.
What are some answers? You have some answers.
I have thoughts. I don't necessarily have some answers.
That's fine.
But I do think that the crisis at this moment was in part driven by
Which crisis?
the funding, the cost crisis,
We have a lot of.
or contributing. There are a lot of crises. I apologize. At least in part, some of the conversation around taxation and the concerns about the volatility of Vermont tax rates were contributed to by the changes to how students were counted. And so I don't have a solution, but I think it is important to understand and hold that there is a tension that actions were taken that escalated the urgency of solving the funding crisis. But again, I think I can't stress enough that if as a state we underfund special education, we risk federal dollars. And so I don't have a solution except to say that in a moment where we're incredibly concerned about costs and about making sure that we have a stronger education system that is funded in a more reasonable way, don't put our federal dollars at risk. And so to that end, I think one of the solutions that I can offer is asking JFO to truly model the foundation formula and how that would affect and be affected by the categories and what the weights would look like. And understand that if that number is lower than what we are currently spending on special education, we risk our federal dollars.
Yes.
Do you, have you talked to AOE about this? Is it, I mean, how do you think this fits into Act 73? Act 73 gonna address that, the issues that we have with special education?
I think the AOE has started to work to try to address some of the systemic challenges in special education. I think one of the kind of driving forces behind the complexity of the challenges that we see is that schools and the professionals in schools are asked constantly. I mean, I have been doing this work for 8 years and I've been around politics in Vermont since 2017, so just a year more. But in my time spending time at the State House, this is like the third or fourth major educational transformation in 8 years. We had Act 46, and that had its struggles. We had 173, and that has had extreme struggles. And now we're talking about just totally, finding a new system, right? And what we have seen repeatedly is poor implementation of sound policy. And so no matter what happens, the AOE needs the resources to be able to meaningfully engage in technical assistance with schools. And meaningful technical assistance does not mean publishing really great materials. It means actively engaging with schools and collaborating with them and being there on the ground with our educators to help stand up what are intended as really strong and working systems. So I think the work is starting. And also the AOE is responding to what's being asked by the executive. And so it is imperative that as a legislative body, you engage in decision making that makes sure that one, all voices are heard, not just the executive. And I think I want to acknowledge and hold tension for the fact that our educators in our educational systems, who you see and come talk to a lot, they're being asked to constantly be very agile in talking about a variety of policy changes. And I don't know that they are being asked, as the people who are deploying educational services, what is going to work. I think they're responding to policy conversations, and maybe it's erudite or glass house of me or glass castle of me, but I wonder if it would make more sense to start from the bottom up.
I agree with your advocacy. I think you're on that somebody needs to just put a special eye on the problem. I think sometimes money, funding drives it for sure.
Yeah.
But to the point where we started losing federal dollars, that's definitely that's not a good thing. What do you think about the special ed students staying in the mainstream in the high schools?
I think inclusion is extremely important. I think inclusion is federally required. And I think that students with disabilities should have the same access to a variety of educational opportunities. For example, our students with disabilities have very different access to our technical centers. And that is not equity in education. When our students with disabilities can't receive their high school education in the tech center.
It's a balance of art for sure.
Absolutely.
So I'm hearing two major messages. One is that you would hope that the agency would be more deeply engaged with helping schools meet their obligation. So, or actually, I hate to use the word obligations, maybe they're for the right thing, making it work well. And the other is for us to pay attention as we're working on the foundation to make sure that it continues to provide the dollars necessary to carry out that money. Or at least make sure we're listening to the federal funds in the bid.
Definitely make sure we don't leave any federal funds on the table. Yeah. And I think to your first point, yes, and I think that yes, the structures and the supportive structures to schools, which need to start at the AOE because they have the general supervision authority over our supervisory unions in our school districts. And also, I think it's important to recognize that districts are so in the weeds, schools and teachers are often so in the weeds. And so, in many ways, entitled doing incredibly difficult jobs that when a really challenging circumstance occurs or a really complex student is for them, it's very easy to kind of get stuck in a row like, oh, we can't do this. And one of the things that I think that the AOE has taken steps to do, and I think should be supported and continuing to do, is being a really agile thought partner for supervisory unions and school districts and for teachers in those moments where they're not seeing the forest for the trees or they're not seeing any other solutions but the most restrictive environment, and being able to partner to have a variety of solutions. And that is happening. I know that is happening from the conversations that I engage in on the special education advisory panel and also from my direct advocacy work. And I do think that there's a stronger opportunity. Schools need to not just be told what needs to be changed. They need to be meaningfully supported in making those changes. Thank you for the good example.
Too many questions. We are right on time.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're switching gears and gaining. We started yesterday, just taking our first look. So, by the way, welcome everybody from the in television land. We are starting to take a look at the map, sort of, which is, as the chair of the House Education Committee made clear, is almost a concept map. Some attempt to draw some lines, but recognizing there's no way working in isolation got them right. So with that, and then all the accompanying language with it. So we're just beginning to get a sense from the field about reaction to school district, the mapping or the, I guess we're not even supposed to call it what a proposal concept. I'll keep using that word. So we have some superintendents with us at this moment. And I don't know which one of you would like to go first. Should I just do them in order the way we have them? Oh, there's Chelsea. Okay. Didn't know she was there. So we actually have Chelsea listed first, the Executive Director, Superintendents Association. We will, quickly before we start, have we had all of you in before? But yeah, we've had you all in. Yeah, you all, yes. Okay, so we'll assume you remember who we are and who you are. So Chelsea, you are up. You can start.
Yes, hi. Sorry about that. I was having a hard time with my internet, so thank you for your patience. My name is Chelsea Myers. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Superintendents Association. We're actually giving joint testimony today, so I'll ask if it's okay that the superintendents also introduce themselves for the testimony.
Of course.
Hi, I'm Brooke Olson-Farrell, Superintendent in Slate Valley and President-elect of the Superintendents Association.
I'm Lynn Coda. I'm the superintendent for the Franklin Northeast Supervisory Union, and I'm the treasurer of the Vermont Superintendents Association.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sheila Soul. I'm superintendent in the Addison Northwest School District, and I am the secretary of Vermont Superintendents Association.
Well, thanks. So you're saying you kind of all want to go to be on together, Chelsea, and just interject with you want to. That's fine.
Yeah, Brooke's gonna kick us off, and we'll answer questions together, and which I'm sure you'll have. And Lynn and Sheila and Brooke also can talk a little bit about their experience. They all have some kind of experience related to consolidation and redistricting. So I'm gonna just let them kind of take it away, and I'm here to answer any questions if you have them.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started, but thank you for inviting testimony on the district consolidation conversation starter introduced last week by Chair Conlin. At the outset, the Vermont Superintendents Association appreciates that this proposal reflects key elements raised repeatedly in our prior testimony, most notably a more reasonable attention to scale and a clearer focus on creating school district structures that are operationally effective and efficient in the context of Vermont. For VSA, this proposal represents an important turning point in the consolidation conversation. Earlier proposals, beginning with the 5-district concept, were non-starters for our members. They failed to account for Vermont's geography, took scale too far, and would have effectively erased local governance while likely increasing rather than reducing costs for taxpayers. Those proposals did not align with how school districts actually function on the ground. This conversation starter strikes a more appropriate balance. It acknowledges the need for greater efficiency and effectiveness in governance and district operations, while not moving so far away from local identity that communities feel disconnected from their schools. Democratically elected school boards could continue to play a meaningful role in decision-making and remain close to schools and the communities they serve. While we cannot speak today to specific borders drawn in the proposal, we do recognize this is a far more earnest and grounded starting point. Even though we do not have a uniform solution to education reform that all superintendents would support given the context each exists within, VSA has been clear that change is needed. We will not oppose progress in the name of the way we've always done things. At the same time, we believe it is important to reiterate that district consolidation is not an end in and of it by itself. Consolidation must be a means to broader reform focused on achieving the right scale at every level, improving the quality and breadth of opportunities available to students, and ensuring that all students have access to a high-quality education regardless of where they live. We also want to acknowledge the proposal's general approach to contracting and designation. While we cannot yet speak to the specifics, we agree with the underlying recognition that Vermont's historic academies and certain independent schools have long played an important role in serving regions without access to local public schools. That said, preserving inefficient governance and operational structures solely to maintain access to independent schools should not be the policy goal. We urge the legislature to explore alternatives to the supervisory union structure that respect the role of historic academies within the broader education delivery system, while avoiding outdated structures that are not serving students or taxpayers well. Once again, the idea that school districts are a far more efficient governance model is a very commonly held belief by VSA superintendents, but it is not unanimously agreed to. As this conversation moves forward, VSA believes it will be critical to support policy decisions with careful analysis and data. In particular, we recommend further examination of the following questions. What new opportunities, programs, and efficiencies could realistically be achieved across larger districts by building on the strongest offerings that currently exist in individual systems? How will the transition be supported for districts, families, students, and communities? How will local governance be determined? What would the proposed districts look like from a collective bargaining perspective? And what would it take to align contracts across new districts, both monetarily and logistically? Given concerns about lower spending districts experiencing tax increases under Act 73, what are the projected tax implications of the proposed?
Oops. Brooke, you froze.
Brooke, if you can hear us, maybe go off and rejoin.
I can pick it up where Brooke left off. If you just give me 1 second.
Oh, so you can pick, okay.
What debts and assets would each system be contending with? Another essential next step is being candid about the timeline and the scope of work required to successfully consolidate districts. Meaningful consolidation does not happen on paper alone. It requires time for governance transitions, contract alignment, staffing decisions, financial system integration, community engagement, and trust building. Superintendents caution that setting unrealistic timelines risks undermining the very efficiencies and opportunities consolidation is meant to achieve. An honest phased implementation plan will be necessary if this work is to be successful and sustainable. We also want to be very clear that school construction aid will be a prerequisite to the success of any meaningful reform. Without addressing the condition, capacity, and flexibility of school facilities, even the most thoughtful governance changes will fall short. Our students deserve learning environments that support the educational opportunities policymakers are trying to create. Finally, we want to address a recurring critique of past consolidation efforts, particularly Act 46, that promised savings and expanded opportunities were not realized. We hear a different story from superintendents who have experienced successful mergers. They witness reinvestment of resources into student opportunities, increased flexibility in staffing and building use, and more resilient systems overall. While education spending has increased statewide, there is no credible way to causally attribute that increase to Act 46 mergers. No one can say what education spending looked like today had those mergers not occurred. What is clear is that Vermont's current governance structures are overly complex and increasingly misaligned with declining enrollment. Reforming these structures must be part of a broader strategy, though, to increase student opportunity, improve system sustainability, and provide long-term relief to taxpayers. The public deserves to see a clear through line between governance reform and operational changes to improved outcomes for students and property tax relief over time. This proposal is an important starting point, and VSA is committed to supporting the work further. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think is there more from?
Yeah, so I don't know if you're interested. I invited Lynn and Sheila and Brooke to join me to just share a little bit more about their experiences in their own systems with consolidation. We could do a quick couple of minutes of that and then answer questions if that works for you.
Sure.
Go ahead, Lynn.
So I am a superintendent that went through Act 46 in a supervisory union structure where we had a side-by-side. So we formed 2 new merged district boards, and we received another town from a neighboring supervisory union. So Sheldon became a part of Franklin Northeast. When I reflect back on that work, I think that I went into it not fully understanding the depth of the work that would need to be done in order to operationalize a merger. And we had to do that across 2 districts. So I made a list just thinking about some of the things that we had to contend with. And the reason I want to share some of that with you is because I think that as we move forward, it's very important that we set a realistic timeline so that we could do this work well. I think all eyes are on us as we move forward in this process, and it behooves us to do the best we can for our students and for our staff. So just thinking about the work that would need to be done by the newly elected board, or in Act 46, that would have been the forming board, there are a lot of, there's a lot of work that has to happen to stand up the new business entity. So those are pieces that our business office has to contend with. We also need to think about the amount of time and work that needs to go in with collective bargaining agreements for merging, collective bargaining agreements for support staff teachers, looking at your administrators as well, curriculum work. There's all kinds of work that needed to happen around technology, new domains for emails and so forth. We have to think about the financial system that we need to stand up, thinking about merging student information systems, policies, how we're going to govern. Are these going to be policy governance boards? There's a superintendent search that has to happen within a timeline. We have to think about our common assessment plan, any sort of absence management system, and then you have to build a budget. And you have to staff a central office, and you have to think about your school level staffing. So in the proposed timeline, that's a lot to do in just a few months. And if any of the new forming boards are going to be run by sitting superintendents, they'll be running 2 entities while also trying to stand that up. So I just ask that this committee really consider past experience around consolidation as you're moving forward. Could I speak a little bit to the supervisor union structure as well? I think one of the barriers that we have found in our supervisory union is that we are not allowed to own property as a supervisory union. So any spaces that we have in terms of our central office or our alternative programs, those are all leased spaces, so not the most financially efficient way of doing business. We also are not allowed to borrow money as an entity, and there are a lot of duplicative services that we do, whether it's at the board level, payrolls, audits, things like that as well.
So I can speak a little bit about Act 46 and my experience. So I am currently the superintendent for the Addison Northwest School District. I've been here for 8 years, but prior to this, I was a curriculum director for 13 years, the last 9 in the Harwood Unified Union School District, where I was involved in the Act 46 work from the teaching and learning standpoint. And I can absolutely say that that consolidation made a significant difference in terms of student outcomes and student learning experiences, to be able to align the learning experiences, especially across 2 middle schools that were feeding into the same one high school, had a significant impact on students. And it made it much easier when we were a district. So I was both working there when it was a supervisory union and experienced a lot of challenges trying to bring, 7 schools together versus doing that as a district, where we were able to really make a lot of improvements along those ends. We were also able to share staff in new ways that we were unable to before. So a lot of those challenges were resolved once we were a district. Coming into Addison Northwest as a superintendent, after 1 year of the district being consolidated, we continued to experience declining enrollment and other things. So 10 years ago, we had 983 students in the district. Today, we have 798. So that's 185 students still lost since consolidation. So also, I think someone earlier in their testimony pointed out that health insurance costs have increased by 230%. Lynn, I think that was your fact. So it's difficult to sort of point to those factors, and say, I think a lot of people just sort of assume then that Act 46 didn't work. Like, here we are having this conversation again. It must be that consolidation didn't work. And I think, if you take into context all of the other things that have happened, that's a hard through line to draw. But I can say that in our district, we were able to be very resourceful with our partners in the Mount Abe district to stand up some shared special education services and other things, but we've taken that about as far as we can without further consolidation. We're going to continue to struggle and continue to keep the learning opportunities that we already have. So more change needs to happen for us. We're too small, and caps are going to really hit our district hard going forward. So without some other change, we don't have the tools to further adapt within our own system.
And just to piggyback on what Lynn and Sheila said. Hopefully everyone can see me and hear me now. Sorry about that earlier. I have had the opportunity to be part of 3 different mergers during my career. One, the first mergers in Mill River when I was assistant superintendent there, and then 2 mergers within Addison Rutland, or Slate Valley, as we're now called. One a voluntary merger, and then one a forced merger when Orwell was forced into the district by the state board. So I have a lot of experience with this, and I will say, hands down, Slate Valley is in a far better position today than it was when we were Addison Rutland Supervisory Union. We've been able to be extremely efficient. We've been able to reduce 45 positions in those 8 years, close a school, open a new middle school. Our student outcomes are higher than they've ever been. So we have been able to make some real change and increase opportunities for students throughout the system. I would say all 3 mergers that I was part of was a supervisory union whose districts became a single district. When we're talking about this scale of mergers, we're talking about supervisory unions merging, or perhaps other school districts merging, and that's a far bigger ask. Because I will say in the supervisory unions that merged, at least in my experience under Act 46, they already had similar transportation contracts, similar curriculum, similar master agreements. There were some things that needed to be worked out, but this would be a far bigger undertaking when you're merging in different entities.
Okay, yeah. So one question, maybe Sheila and Lynn, you kind of spurred the thought here a little bit, talking about SUs and SDs. SUs are creatures of statute. Like you talked about, that they can't borrow money, they can't own property. We actually can fix that. We actually can make that, because they're creatures of statute. So are there, to the extent that the committee is considering allowing some areas of the state that want to remain SUs, what are some of the things that you might suggest that we think about as for changing the SU structure, or what they're allowed to do, and give them a little bit more authority or ability to do things that make sense if you were still running an SU? You may talk about that. You don't have to, because you might.
I have a list that we generated at some point when this conversation was happening in the redistricting task force. I'm happy to share it with the committee and pass it off to Lynn and Sheila and Brooke too.
Okay, that would be great if you could do that. Yeah.
I think when I have a hard time with the question around supervisory unions, because I think I have, by having the side-by-side structure that I have within my supervisory union, I have greater flexibility than I had before in each of those districts, but I can't cross the districts. And I think that when we have needs that, so we have a very transient population. So emerging multilingual students, for example, it is a barrier when you have multiple employers under one umbrella. It makes the most sense to have the greatest flexibility to be able to utilize both your human and your physical resources in a way that's really responsive to student needs. I think what many people would have previously said is one of the biggest drivers for a supervisory union had to do with students being able to attend some of our historic academies and some of our independent schools. I will say one thing that I appreciated in Peter's well, it's not a proposal, but in what was written, is that the designation contract piece of his proposal still allows to create a less complicated governance structure while still allowing a pathway for our historic academies and some of our independent schools, which we all are supportive of because we know that, you know, we have a heavy reliance in some parts of the state for areas of the state that don't have public schools that students could attend. So I think that it is kind of a mixture of both, the best of both worlds.
Thank you.
I think one thing that I would add in my recollection of the biggest issues that we had as the supervisory union too was the local communities not being able to, you know, vote on that budget per se. So the central office costs were assessed costs out to the schools, and there really wasn't a way to provide, you know, from their opinion, oversight into those charges, right? Whereas a local, you know, now as a district, we have one budget. And so there's more transparency possibly into what is driving those costs for the taxpayers.
So I pulled up the testimony that we did previously. We did an exercise with our members on what were qualities of effective governance structures, governance and operational structures. And it's a shared unified mission and vision, coordinated curriculum and instruction, increased student access to academic programs or equity amongst the districts, providing staffing flexibility, streamlining financial management, strengthening leadership capacity. So when your leadership is being pulled away to repeat multiple processes operationally and in governance, there's less time for instructional leadership. Promoting equity and cohesion across communities by ensuring the fair distribution of resources, and supporting student continuity so that families moving within a governance structure boundary do not face unnecessary school transitions. A student could move a couple of houses down and be in the same supervisory union, and they still would have to move schools. And then just clarity of roles and transparent decision-making, which Sheila just talked about. That was our list.
Okay. Do we have some? She's going to send it.
Yes, I can do that. Yep.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you. That was helpful. Thanks for your time. Thanks for coming in. And we may well see you again.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So we can go off. We're also, before you do that, we can go off. Our next witness is at 3. So we're off until 3. Good. And we're shifting gears so everybody can be ready
Again.
to 2:32.